The Calvert County flag, a symbol of Southern Marylanders everywhere. It is comprised of the flag of Lord Baltimore, overlaid with a tobacco leaf. If you ask anybody from Calvert County what a defining characteristic of the region is, a large portion would undoubtedly say tobacco. The crop is rooted in the culture of the state, as many have made their livelihood solely off the plant since the early 17th century. However, by the end of the 20th century, the economy of the state of Maryland was on shaky ground. Between a jump in population, a shift in energy production, and a reliance on tobacco as a cash crop, it seemed as though any gust of wind would blow this house of cards down.
The latter of these would prove especially problematic, as not only was the market for this plant constantly in flux, more research supporting the dangers of consuming tobacco would make the public eye concerned with the state's level of production.
That cigarette smoking is a health hazard of sufficient importance to the United States to warrant remedial action.
In 1998, Governor Paris N. Glendenning proposed to the state legislature a program to ease the region out of tobacco and into more beneficial products.
People are rethinking how they do things, what the future is going to look like.
With newly acquired funds from the 1998 Master Settlement Agreement lawsuit between 46 states and the Philip Morris, R.J. Reynolds, Brown & Williamson, and Lorillard tobacco companies, each state was granted a portion of the compensation. Using their portion, Maryland allotted $78 million that would be put into a tobacco buyout.
The buyout was as follows. Those who accepted would be compensated $1 per pound for the next 10 years based on their average poundage in the prior 3 years. However, they would be required to continue growing something else over the following decade and would be prohibited from using their property to grow tobacco indefinitely, including if the property changed hands from sale. The goal of this program was to reduce the amount of tobacco Maryland was collectively producing by giving it to farmers, who grew it the ability to safely transition away from it. While critics would mourn at the culture that was lost, the Maryland tobacco buyout would allow the state to break a harmful cycle that was a dependence on the tobacco plant. The new era that resulted from this legislation would allow a diversification of the region to agriculture, a shift in lifestyle, and facilitate a more modern and healthy economy.
It had been known for decades that usage of tobacco products had been causing lung disease and cancers in the body. Despite this, many growers were unable to transition to something more socially acceptable because tobacco was the only crop that was sustainable for farmers looking to keep food on their table.
Well, 1 acre tobacco before the buyout was probably worth 10 or 15 acres of grain, corn or soybeans.
This massive difference in price meant that even for growers that did not want to contribute to the epidemic resulting from tobacco, to stay in the black, they would have no other option. The introduction of the buyout, however, would allow a cushion for farmers to pursue other healthier means of profit. Many farmers would use their share of buyout money to buy the seed and farming tools necessary to raise new crops or livestock. Flowers, peppers, grapes, corn, hay, and soybeans are just a few of the different plants that would be grown using the buyout dividends. Soybeans in particular were one of the most favored alternatives for those looking to convert from tobacco. While tobacco was very harsh on the soil of its fields, putting a lot of strain and using up large amounts of nutrients, soybeans would allow the farmland to recover from the years of tobacco growing due to its lighter growing tendencies. Those wanting to escape growing entirely may have opted to nurture the state's newly growing equine, cattle, and goat populations for either recreational use or for consumption. The infrastructure of Maryland also reflected the transition from tobacco, as warehouses in Waldorf that were previously used in tobacco auctions were now used for farmers and produce markets. The sellers using the newly renovated markets had been there in the past, but for a different purpose. Almost all people that boasted products at the markets were former tobacco growers. The buyout gave those looking for something to grow other than tobacco that opportunity, because no other programs were being implemented that allowed them to do this.
Tobacco is one of the most labor-intensive crops that a farmer can raise. Between planting the seeds in late winter, tending to the crops over spring, harvesting each plant, spearing every leaf, hanging them up to dry, stripping the leaves in autumn, and preparing the finished product for shipping, the attention to detail this plant demands is unparalleled. Because of this, labor was another problem that arose for the farmers of tobacco. The newer generation was not as quick to jump on farming careers, as they could earn exponentially more elsewhere for a fraction of the manual labor and hours. A typical farmer would make about $20,000 a year, which was far below other careers in the area.
It's a big process, and it's very intensively hands-on from the moment that seed is put in the ground to the time you take it to market.
On top of that, the spike in population in the 90s for places around Calvert County meant that construction was a booming business, and many of the younger people who originally chose to work in the fields would change their jobs in favor of construction. Smaller firms would take a bigger hit, as their lack of influence and outreach would mean that hiring was a critical issue. The buyout proved helpful in this area, as the transition to crops like vegetables, which were much more low maintenance, would allow the older generation to not have concern about their chores around the farm getting done. Another pain lifestyle that the buyout helped farmers alleviate was being forced to work multiple part-time jobs and able to sustain their family. Most growers would have to work extra wage-based jobs in chain businesses around the region. Unsurprisingly, farmers also had some of the worst mental and physical health problems, almost certainly due to the strain of attempting to balance their crop, their money, their family, and their other jobs all at once. The buyout provided enough money so that the farmers could maintain a steady stream of income while exclusively farming. The life of the average farmer changed dramatically due to the introduction of the buyout, and the workforce of Southern Maryland was much more stable.
One constant in every stable economy is consistency. This was one thing that Southern Maryland did not possess in the late 20th century. Because of a drought that occurred along the east coast of the United States in 1982 through 1983, buyers would not be able to offer suppliers a steady price. A consequence of this was a transition from a public auction-based selling system for tobacco to a contract-based system. The latter was problematic for growers because not only did they lose the value of face-to-face interaction while selling, they signed into a deal where they outlined one quantity that they would be expected to produce for a number of years.
It was different than the camaraderie of an auction house. Every year you'd go to the auction house, the one that you would sell to, and you'd see people you hadn't seen for a year. And everybody would be there to sell their wares and hope for the best. And
due to the nature of farming, this was often incredibly unrealistic and frustrating for growers. If they made over the poundage that they outlined in the contract, the partnering company would typically refuse it and it would be wasted. However, if the harvest was low for a year and their pounds were below what was in the contract, punishment via fines or abandonment of the partnership could be enforced. The main reason that this was a problem was because 9 times out of 10, farmers had no control over the yield for any given year. Also, an economy based on tobacco in general is inherently unhealthy. The buyout served as a solution to both of these issues. Farmers would no longer be restrained through contractually obligated settlements with large companies that could take advantage of them, and instead would be able to return to selling their products, which were now things like vegetables, at local markets and in public auctions. Also, the farmers of Southern Maryland would be making their livelihood from one another for making product, instead of from corporations and monopolies for producing a cancerous crop. The economy of the counties around Calvert would change forever due to the effects of the buyout.
Not all the effects of the buyout were positive, however. Many found it insulting that the government would be willing to even consider eliminating the culture that had been built up around tobacco and its production.
Those of us who grew tobacco, even those who came and helped us cut tobacco, there was a pride. There was a generational cultural pride that went into the task.
Colonial Maryland was founded on 2 principles: its religious diversity and its tobacco growing potential. For hundreds of years since then, tobacco has stayed in the families of farmers across the state, so for the government to abruptly decide that it would be no longer endorsing the plant was outrageous to some. Though hard to raise, farmers statewide felt a mutual connection to the plant, and deciding whether or not to take the buyout was an emotional experience for many. The period when the buyout was in the process of being enacted was filled with protest, controversy, and mixed feelings from the public. Farmers who continued to raise their crop were faced with public hate. Passerbys would yell profanities criticizing them for raising an evil plant and call them murderers. The period of transition was very difficult for Southern Maryland because the subject of concern was a deeply emotional topic for many residents of the area. Eventually, though, some would continue to grow the plant for tradition's sake. Tobacco farms would become a rarity as about 85% of the farmers would take the buyout.
The tobacco buyout was certainly a new leaf for Southern Maryland because of the cultural and economic metamorphosis it allowed for the state. The program pushed Maryland into a new era, one where farmers have the ability to choose whatever field of agriculture they desire. The tobacco buyout was the first program of its kind in America. In the following years, many states would implement similar tobacco transition payment programs, taking inspiration from Maryland's own buyout. This turning point in history would help local farmers stabilize the economy and inspire similar programs, proving its status as one of the most important pieces of legislation to ever be passed for the state.